Hi, I'm Alan Rusbridger, editor of Prospect Magazine, and you're about to watch the interview portion of the latest episode of Media Confidential with myself and Lionel Barber, in which we speak to a special guest. If you want to watch the full episode, please click on the link below, and if you want to subscribe to Prospect Magazine, please visit our website at www.prospectmagazine.co.uk. Enjoy. Well, we're thrilled to be joined by Rebecca Solnit, a distinguished writer and observer of the American political scene. Rebecca, you've just written a piece in The Guardian joining a chorus of other writers, expressing really quite extreme disquiet at the way that this presidential race is being covered. Can you just summarize for us the argument that you made in that piece?
Yeah, my argument is an argument a lot of people are making. The real facts of the situation, a lot of the real news aren't being covered, notably the fact that Donald Trump is increasingly incoherent, incompetent, and making dire threats to deport millions of immigrants, end democracy in America, all our climate action, and other things that really matter. And so, like a lot of my fellow journalists, I get up every morning and look at my other sources for the real news and then check the major newspapers to see if it made it in. And most days it feels like the major stories are missing or they've somehow been tweaked to look balanced or normal or something that they're not. So we're in a situation where it feels like it's an unprecedented emergency for this country, and because this country dominates the world, for the world, and the public is not being told by the press with the most power to do so.
Somebody's coined the phrase sane washing to describe what's happening with Trump, i.e. you've got somebody who is far from normal, whether he's clinically diagnosable or not is a moot question. But reporters in their covering of him are essentially covering up for him. Do you recognize that as a syndrome?
I absolutely do, and lots of us do. Trump will go into these absolutely incoherent things that aren't even word salad. They're word soup at this point. And reporters will try and extract something coherent from it. You know, he'll say a few hundred words of gibberish, and somebody will make it sound in the papers or on the news like he made a policy point that seems like, you know, a coherent policy point when often it wasn't there at all. So, you know, that's sane washing, and his incapacity to be coherent is pretty much hidden from the public unless they're listening directly or reading alternative media.
Could you give us a couple of tangible stories, Rebecca, that were reported in the mainstream press, like the New York Times, which in your view are classic examples of sane washing?
Yeah, the example everybody's been jumping on in the last few days is that Trump talked to a New York economic forum and was asked a question about childcare, which is a real crisis for working parents. And he went into this soliloquy that didn't answer the question at all and touched on all these obscure things and was full of grammatical incoherence and the Trump's usual, we're going to build the greatest whatever. And then he somehow suggested that tariffs were going to pay for childcare, which doesn't make sense at all. And it wasn't reported that way in the New York Times. I don't think the Washington Post did, although the Washington Post did have a breakthrough recently on actually describing reality as we witness it. And we are seeing the Times and the Post, the two major U.S. newspapers, I think because of this pressure and shaming, beginning to occasionally crack and let the truth in. But that was one example where, you know, hundreds of words of gibberish were mostly off topic or incomprehensible, were turned into a few crisp sentences as though that's what he'd said.
So, Rebecca, I want to put you under the spotlight. You are now the editor of the New York Times. What would you be saying to the reporters covering the crucial? I mean, this is going to be watched by tens of millions of people, the debate between Vice President Kamala Harris and ex-President Donald Trump on ABC News. What guidelines would you be offering?
Well, now that you've made me the editor-in-chief of the New York Times, I think I'd fire most of the columnists and dismiss most of the political reporters. And
You're
they've
tough.
got,
You're very tough, Rebecca.
you know,
Carry on.
crises require extreme responses. And they've got a lot of fantastic investigative journalists who do report the truth. People like Megan Twomey and Jodi Kantor. I'd haul in people who haven't been doing this distorted coverage, who don't have this history to write fresh the way they report on other stories. Or maybe I'd just hire, some of the great independents who are doing the job. But
are there any specific, you're a great writer, an award-winning writer, bestseller. In terms of the writing, what would you be telling the reporters to focus on in this debate?
I think we'd be focusing on who's telling the truth, who has a coherent plan, who has a criminal history. The fact that an adjudicated rapist and convicted felon who attempted a coup against this government is being treated as a normal political candidate while he threatens to end elections and democracy in America and threatens, to harm against his enemies, immigrants, etc., asked for $1 billion bribe from the fossil fuel industry, may have gotten a $10 million bribe from the dictator of Egypt, etc. How do you denormalize that? And maybe not all of it comes up in the debate, but it should. The other thing I would do, which I did for The Guardian when I covered the Biden-Trump debate on June 27th, is look at the biases of the questions themselves, because Dana Bash and the other guy completely normalized outrageous things Trump said last time. Trump in the June 27th debate claimed that mothers and doctors are conspiring to commit infanticide at birth, a lie he's been telling almost unchecked since at least 2019. So he said this lie in the debate, and what did Dana Bash say? She said, "Thank you." And then she asked Biden a question. And so I think a lot of the problem is not just Trump. It's that the debate format, this sort of gladiatorial ridiculousness, and the interlocutors in this format have themselves been huge problems all along. They were in 2016 and 2020, and they probably will be in 2024 again.
Rebecca, we know that after 2016, there was a great deal of soul searching in American newsrooms. And they thought, how could we have got it so wrong? Do you think part of what's happening at the moment is a kind of overcompensation? You've got editors who are looking at the polls saying they're 50-50. We don't want to be caught out again on the wrong side of history.
No, I think what they got wrong in 2016 is how they covered the race. Think Hillary Clinton, who won by 2.9 million votes but lost the Electoral College in a very corrupted election. Lost for a lot of different reasons, including her own shortcomings, but a huge part was biased coverage. The New York Times devoted more coverage in 6 days to her bullshit email scandal than they did to the policy positions of both candidates. The fact that Donald Trump was a serial bankrupt business failure with a lot of criminal associates and a history of stiffing employees, sexually assaulting women, etc., was something that should have been covered thoroughly by the U.S. press and wasn't. People really thought he was the fictional character on The Apprentice, and I believe that's who they voted for. The New York Times in particular, his hometown paper, where a lot of his crimes had been committed locally, absolutely failed to let the public know who Donald Trump really was, to tell us what he was going to do. And I think that was a failure that they didn't really address. They all just covered up and carried on. And in fact, they spent the next 4 years finding it really hard to call a lie when it came out of his mouth, under-reporting or softening reporting on what the Trump administration was actually doing, which was often illegal, and corrupt. And really gaslighting the public. And they also constantly went to Trump voters to see how they felt about everything, particularly the New York Times. Anything that happened, you had to see how right-wingers felt and whether they felt good about it. And there was an absolute asymmetry on that front, too, that really anointed racist white people as the real Americans whose needs and desires and beliefs mattered much more than progressive people, non-white people, etc. So I don't think the papers ever corrected themselves.
But all that may be true, but at the same time, there was a perception that the East Coast media, in particular, just misread it. They didn't believe that this was going to happen, and there must be some sense of covering their backs this time. They don't want to be made to look foolish again, given the race is so tight.
In 2016, Hillary Clinton was given by the polls a huge chance of winning, I think an 85% chance close to the election. And a lot of people confused 85% with 100%. And then we got to spend 4 years in the 15%. And we're still living in its aftermath. I think the whole obsession with polls is part of the problem. And the New York Times in particular is notorious for polls that lean more right than the rest of the polls, or most of the rest of the polls out there. And they have a habit of releasing a poll that looks really good for Republicans and then getting an onslaught of their staff to build stories on it. And the Times, part of their corrosiveness at this point is that they're essentially campaigning for their agenda. They campaigned since February for Biden to step down with massive stories that felt like it was coming out of Pravda, because all their opinion writers would essentially write the same opinion.
Just to be clear, Rebecca, you do now think that it was right for the president to step down on health grounds?
I think his health was fine. I think he's old and a bit tired. He's had a stuttering problem, which makes him sound goofy. Ezra Klein at the New York Times, and the New York Times in particular, and then a whole lot of kind of high status insider white men all started lobbying to get rid of Biden, particularly after the June 27th debate. But Klein had started in February. And what those guys wanted was an open convention, which meant they would have pushed Biden out, and then we would have gone for several weeks to several months with no candidate. You cannot fundraise, you cannot get out the vote, you cannot campaign without a candidate. It was a disastrous idea, and that's what I opposed. And they reluctantly recognized towards the end that the only logical and really legal successor and the only democratic successor was somebody we already voted for and voted for in 2020. The main function of a vice president is to be the replacement should something happen to the president. And so I'm very happy that Kamala Harris is the candidate. When I saw how almost rapturous and generous the reception of her was after Biden stepped down, I felt like I lived in a better country, because I've seen so many women and people of color, and particularly women of color, attacked when they run for office. So I think where we are is great, but I think the process of how Biden was pushed out, how a kind of media stampede of distortion, misinformation, et cetera, happened was really disgraceful and kind of shocking. And the press has essentially decided it's, the fourth sort of pillar of government in a country that's supposed to have three, and that they should really be in charge of a lot of the major decisions, whether it's about going to war in Iraq, about to be the Democratic candidate, et cetera. And that's not really what the press should be doing.
Rebecca, I have a lot of sympathy with what you're saying about, I think it was Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor of The Atlantic, talked about a bias towards coherence in the mainstream media. And I've got some good news in that the book, and I think it is I'm about to review it in the Financial Times, the book Lucky Loser by the two Pulitzer Prize winning New York Times journalists, exposing Trump's business record. I mean, this is 500 pages. It's devastating. It's going to come out in a few days. That will set the record straight, at least for those who want to read it. But let me just turn to something else, which is the lawfare aspect of this campaign, these cases that have been brought. Do you not agree that actually the press has reported on these cases poorly, in that particularly the payments, hush payments to Stormy Daniels, the case in New York by Alvin Bragg, that actually is flawed when it comes to election campaign offense? And secondly, the case on the valuation of real estate. That also has a lot of questions about the quality of the prosecution. Is that not a case also of sort of sane washing, that we should be actually more critical of these cases?
I'm not quite sure what you're trying to say, that the prosecution itself was somehow problematic, or that
Yes,
the
I am.
coverage of them was. I don't think it was problematic, short version. And I actually think a huge number of crimes Trump committed, including violating the emoluments clause of the Constitution by
I see that.
profiting off the presidency, have gone unprosecuted, and that Biden's Attorney General, Merrick Garland, has been astonishingly sluggish in prosecuting things, which is why 4 years after the last election, they're still getting around to, prosecuting, sentencing, trying these cases in many respects.
Becca, Lionel asked you earlier to name an example of sane washing. You wrote in your Guardian piece about examples of stories that are being ignored or where, in your view, there's false equivalence. Can you give a couple of examples of those?
God, I do not actually hate to keep picking on the New York Times because they worked very hard to earn it. But there was a remarkable story in the New York Times. I have notes. Harris and Trump have housing ideas. Economists have doubts. A classic New York Times headline. Harris's economic plans were very normal, kind of progressive, help first-time home buyers with certain income levels with down payments, etc. Trump's housing plan was described as mass deportation of undocumented immigrants, which would round up millions of people, put them in camps, dump them in other countries, and disrupt the building trade, the agriculture, the food industry, and everything else in this country. And I'm pretty confident lead to mass protests. But it was described as just a perfectly reasonable economic approach. It really felt like Jonathan Swift's modest proposal, where he suggests the Irish could solve their hunger problem by eating their toddlers. So, that was a sane washing thing.
That's a fantastic example.
That is a very good example.
That the 1625 project, the 2025 project, has also been grossly underplayed by the mainstream media, but you found it more comprehensively covered in so-called alternative channel.
There was this remarkable moment in July when the mainstream media was really neglecting the 2025 plan, which is to institute authoritarianism on day one if Trump wins. Ordinary people on social media started circulating information at a level that I think really shifted. I think there was a study demonstrating it shifted public awareness of the problem. And that's a really interesting thing happening right now, is that where these very well-funded, huge media organizations should be leading public awareness of important issues, they're often nagged, prodded, and dragged into coverage by the public, by smaller presses, independent journalists, etc. Something very striking that happened when Biden gave the State of the Union address and the wacky lady senator from Alabama gave the rebuttal. What happened is that she told a long story about a Mexican woman who'd been sexually trafficked, suggesting it had happened during the Biden administration, and otherwise telling a lot of falsehoods about it. And you guys are professional journalists. You know that, or editors, you know that when something big like that happens, there must be dozens of editors kind of journalists assigned to watch something like that, but it was an independent journalist with a little tiny independent newsletter who actually went out and fact-checked the story about trafficking, released the story on TikTok that it was a bunch of lies, and all the mainstream newspapers, without shame, picked it up from this guy who's probably making a modest income off a lot of individual subscribers at his little project. And to me, that he did the job and they didn't really indicated where we are. There's a lot of fantastic journalists working in this country. A lot of them are at small publications like The New Republic. They've got independent newsletters on Substack or other platforms. They're very active on social media, particularly Twitter, aka X, and they're doing the job that the mainstream publications have been doing. I get up every morning and look at what they're saying, and then I look at the newspapers to see if the newspapers have picked it up. I don't look at the newspapers for the real news.
You also single out Heather Cox Richardson for her blog on Facebook. Yeah.
No, she's been astonishingly successful. She's got about 3 million people reading her, which means she's coming close to the size of the Washington Post online, which is pretty staggering for a history professor almost no one had heard of before the autumn of 2019.
And one of the important things that Heather Cox Richardson does is use context. So you're getting historical context. And if I were to criticize the coverage, is that it lacks context. It's noise. You need to distinguish. You need to have in your mind, if you're going to make a judgment about a figure like Trump, is, well, what's gone on in the past? How abnormal is this? And that's what she offers.
What's striking about Heather's work, and I do know her personally, is that she's demonstrating that a whole lot of people in this country are not looking for more horse race, clickbait, sensationalism, personality stories. They're looking for solid reporting with historical context. And the fact that 3 million people are excited to read about how this era resembles the lead up to the Civil War or other crises in this country's past is really striking. People want good news, and she's making a shocking amount of money because people are voluntarily paying for what she's doing. And it just says a lot about the reading public versus what's out there, I think.
So, Rebecca, you've already fired most of the editors of the mainstream media. To be serious, I mean, is there anything that you would advise to try to correct this, either towards the end of this campaign as we reach a climax, or for the next campaign? What is the answer? Is it better training? Is it giving journalists history lessons? What?
I think that people in the political press live inside a kind of feedback loop, mirror world, confirmation bias bubble in which they echo each other. They normalize certain positions that are not very coherent or honest assessments of the situation. And they're more preoccupied with what I call the aesthetics of objectivity, making things look balanced by treating Democrats and Republicans the same, even though one of them is engaged in a wholesale assault on the Constitution, the rule of law, human rights, and reality itself with constant lies. So, just make a little adjustment in that, perhaps.
I think you should be training the next generation of journalists. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for joining us today.
Welcome. You're welcome.
Fingers crossed for what happens between now and November the 6th.
Thank you, Rebecca. It was a privilege to talk to you.